What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Every new Pokemon generation brings us new Pokemon, but also new soil on which to plant our feet. Each new region brings its own special flair, inundating us with their own unique culture. However, these locations are not pulled from thin air. Each region is largely based on real-life locations in our world, to help guide the creators' minds in terms of physical layout and their society. So I thought it might be interesting to see what other sorts of real-world locations might make good Pokemon regions in the future. Now, I realize that I am far from the first person to talk about this, and there's no way that I could get as in-depth as someone like Mr. Buddy, who has spent hours on this topic. But after skyrocketing past the 25,000 milestone, I thought it might be a fitting exercise to undertake. So, here are the top 6 possible real-world locations for new Pokemon regions. Number 6. India. I'll be up front. I was gonna put the United Kingdom here, and I'm sure that you could easily have a region there, but then I got to thinking about all the other parts of what used to be its vast empire, and India immediately captured my imagination. So sorry to our friends across the pond, but if the rumors are true, then you'll get your time to shine in Gen 8 anyway. As I said, I don't have the time or patience right now to create intricate Pokemon region maps based on the real-world locations, even if I knew where to start. But simply looking at this subcontinent, you can tell that they would have more than enough space for a decent number of cities, as well as naturally have different environments. India has numerous jungle areas that already have an abundance of unique animal species that could be a perfect way to introduce a gaggle of new Pokemon. Also, there's the potential to have some sort of ruins deep within the jungle, maybe even a whole city of people that live in isolation in this ancient structure, which I think would be incredibly cool. There's also a desert over in the west of India, so we can put one there in the games as well. Having a sandy route or two has been a staple in Pokemon for a while now, but this one would actually make sense with the real-world equivalent. Also, up north you have the Himalayas, which if you were ever going to make a mountainous, snowy area, there is no better excuse. Also, the culture of the region is one that would be exciting to explore, and definitely distinctive compared to others. The architecture alone is impressive on its own right, and could be reflected beautifully. There would undoubtedly be some offshoot of the Taj Mahal, as it's one of the most iconic locations from India. Could it be a gym, or some sort of meeting place? Even the Evil Team headquarters? I don't know, but you can bet that it would be in the game. The other cities would vary between larger metropolitan centers that have pleasant marketplaces, and then you could visit smaller villages, maybe even having a commentary on the difference between the two as part of the game. Also, just in case you were wondering about not having enough water areas, there are many potential spots for rivers that one could surf or fish on, especially seeing as how the Ganges is pretty big. These reasons and others make me think that India would really be a solid choice for a new Pokemon region, and it would certainly be one that I would enjoy playing. Number 5. Mesoamerica. For this, I want to include the general areas between Mexico and South America, even though I realize that whole portion of the map is not called Mesoamerica. However, I want this region to be able to play with as much as possible. In the last entry, we speculated about a potential presence in the ruins out in the jungle, but here it is almost an absolute necessity. I love all the ancient remnants of the civilizations here, like the Aztecs and the Mayans. It could even be part of the plot that a fringe group has taken up residence in the old stone structures due to their distaste for the rest of the region. They could be considered trouble, but once the evil team strikes, they could emerge from their self-imposed exile and aid in their defeat, using the deeper bonds that they forged with their Pokemon from living with them in nature. Anyway, since the area under consideration here is comprised of several countries, each one could give off its own vibe and feel different from the rest. Some people might say that this is a bit too big of an area, since other whole regions have been narrowed down to much smaller real-life locations. But the world is very big, and by the time they'll have to worry about repeating themselves, we will all be long dead, so really, who cares? If food alone were the only consideration, I would greenlight this region immediately. but as we all know, it seems that you never really have to eat in the Pokemon games. I'm also imagining a very trendy, touristy spot on some of the coastal portions, and then seeing more of what the natives are naturally like further inland. It would be easy enough to find some areas to put mountains or caves. Can you imagine going through an ancient man-made structure that's now been overrun by Pokemon out in the jungle? It would be just like the ruins of Alph, but, you know, with worthwhile Pokemon. You could also definitely have some nice water routes around the whole map. I'm thinking of some kind of specific parallel with the Panama Canal. There are many reasons why a Pokemon game set in this unique location could work, but we're on a schedule, so if I haven't convinced you by now, I never will. Number 4. Egypt. Egypt is a land that is littered with remnants of the past. The most iconic being the Great Pyramid that would undoubtedly be displayed in any Pokemon region that were to be made. There could also be a huge wealth of knowledge at the equivalent of the library at Alexandria. And then of course there is the Sphinx, which can also make an appearance as a location, but could really be an inspiration for an actual new pocket monster in the region. With that, there could also be a number of Pokemon based on common depictions of a jackal or an ibis or any other animal head that might be stuck onto a human. And I couldn't get out of my head the possibility of having the legendary Pokemon of this region being based around the 10 plagues from the biblical book of Exodus. That would truly be epic. The only problem is that there's really only so much land in Egypt that isn't a desert. Really only the areas around the Nile River. But it is the biggest river in the world, so it could provide enough water to where things wouldn't get stale. We could also take some liberties and turn some of the desert areas into mountainous terrain. Including some of the Mediterranean Sea at the top might help things as well. Basically, it would be physically structured a bit differently than your standard region, but I think it might be a nice change of pace for some people, and the unique culture would definitely make a splash and cement its place among all the other regions. Number 3. The continental United States. The only pushback I can see on this one would be that I shouldn't do so much at once, since they potentially could do one for every state in the Union. But that only sounds good in theory. As much as Wyoming might provide diverse terrain, a square does not a compelling region map make. So while they probably will give us other individual states in the future, I think the Founding Fathers might have been onto something, and that we're stronger as a whole. You would start in a small town, as always, so for that I'm thinking either the Midwest or the South, since the coasts are generally higher population centers. Either way, I think moving downward to Louisiana would be a good first step, so that we could visit the stand-in for New Orleans, as well as a sort of wetland swampy area. But you wouldn't get stuck this time. You could then go over to some of the beaches in Florida, but obviously you don't have surf at this point, so it would only entice you to come back later. You could then creep up into the Appalachian Mountains, all the while still experiencing that sweet southern hospitality. But then you could finally move up north to the Great Lakes area, where I'm envisioning a more industrial city where the Chicago of the game would clearly have a badge. Then there's the plains out in the middle, and immediately west of that you have the Rocky Mountains. Though we might wait and put that at the end of the game, and make the Elite Four around the Denver area. You know, just like the Hunger Games capital. The desert in the southwest is already there too, and surely you would be able to do something impressive with the Grand Canyon. And should we travel up to the northwest, we could utilize the beautiful redwoods for a truly distinctive forest in the Pokemon world. And hey, in the post-game, maybe we could even revisit the Unova region right next to it. Again, if this is all too much for a single region, I could see that, but I'm just here for the ideas. If they can draw inspiration for 3 or even 5 regions out of the ones that I'm suggesting, then I say go for it. I'll just expect a reasonable co-production fee. Number 2. Australia. Going down under for a Pokemon region seems like a no-brainer, mostly because it's basically already like a real Pokemon region in real life. The general shape is almost perfect for that nondescript landmass many regions take the form of. not to mention that it's got a leg up on some other places. The Australian outback is entrenched in their image. However, it's not just the depictions you might be familiar with. Sure, there are the rather dry portions in the interior, but the outback also houses its own tropical zones and even more standard temperate areas. So basically, it's got it all. And just think of the water routes. Not only would they fit perfectly with all the coastlines, but the actual waters around Australia house some of the most impressive aquatic sights you could imagine. All the various species of fish and coral reefs make it ripe for the new Pokemon to be created. And speaking of new Pokemon, Australia has its fair share of unique creatures. Maybe more than anywhere else in the world. Australia has so many animals that can only be found there, enough that you could probably just make the whole dex full of them. And even though we've already had some Pokemon that might fit that model, I feel that if they needed to, they could put their own spin on it and do just fine. But there are not only grand outdoor locations here, since there are a number of big modern cities with a decent enough spread around the various states and territories. And of course there would have to be a parallel version of the Sydney Opera House, since you gotta get in those real-life spots and have them all Pokefied. And hey, maybe in the post-game you could even go over to New Zealand. That would be pretty great if you ask me. This corner of the world is distinctive and full of character, and could easily provide a brilliant new region in the Pokemon games that would be a fan favorite for years to come. Number 1. Greece. The most interesting Pokemon region to me would be to have Greece as the major player, but not just as the modern Greece. I would like to propose that we base the region off of a hybrid between the Greece that we have today and the one that we're familiar with from ancient times. First off, there's a great balance of land and water areas from the beginning. You can tell just by looking at the map. Pick just about any random spot and you could have a solid hometown. But I think the culture here is what would be the biggest advantage that this region could possibly have. My idea is to base the cities off of the city-states from the Greece of old. They generally have their own distinct personalities from one another. We all know Sparta as the spot where all the warriors come from in Greece, and while they would not be quite as bloodthirsty as their ancient brethren, they could be obsessed with battling Pokemon, and maybe even have a sort of battle frontier place that you could revisit after the postgame. Athens is another one that has its own unique flair. They have the stereotype of being quite knowledgeable and valuing learning. This means that we could have a giant library or museum of some kind, and probably the trainer school. The city of Corinth could be a large port town, used for trade and the center of commerce, where the equivalent of the mall would be to buy most of your stuff. You wouldn't have to wear a toga or anything, but drawing from the past, while set in the modern day, I think would make a fantastic experience for a Pokemon game. Sort of like how they did it in Alola. And another aspect we could use would be to have some of the Pokemon, probably legendaries, draw their inspiration from the pantheon of Greek gods and goddesses. Or actually, maybe even the gym leaders. But either way, this is a vibrant and diverse cast of characters we have here that could lead to some pretty interesting story points. And while pretty much all of these regions that I've suggested have some sort of ruins or remnant of an ancient civilization, this one especially seems like a prime location for the Order of Antiquity to set up shop. Having the modern Mediterranean culture stitched together with the well-founded tropes developed from olden times would make each spot feel unique on its own, and stand out all the more to be one of the best regions that we could have in the Pokemon world. So, those are the top 6 real-world locations that I would make into Pokemon regions. Which places would you add to Pokemon? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!